This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm your co-host, Dan Newman, joined as always by my co-host and my brother, Andrew Newman, and we have a special listener request episode today. A listener wrote in and to hellooldsports@gmail.com, which we encourage you all to do as well, and had a suggestion for an episode, and we figured we'd pick up on this topic. So before we get to that, Andrew, how are you today?
I'm good, and I think it's important that you specify that, yes, it's if you want to contact us, send it through that email address, because I appreciate the enthusiasm, but people who come up to me when I'm trying to eat with my kids, somehow they get a hold of my home address and send me things to sign in my home address, and at the airport, there's a time and a place to do these things. So please, if you want to get in touch with us, please do it through the official channels, as opposed to to trying to get in touch with us during our rare free time.
A little bit of sarcasm there. And you can also contact us through the Sports History Network website. That's another way to get a hold of us. And we also, as usual, encourage you all to rate, anything you can do on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast of choice. Follow us on Facebook at Hello Old Sports Podcast. So lots of ways to get in touch with us, like Andrew said, that doesn't have to cross the line into extreme fandom. So just real quick, the gentleman who wrote to us, his name was Lawrence Richards, and he suggested that we do a show on teams that should have won the title versus those who actually did. And he said that it's something that he covers as well in his own book, Sports and Boomers, The History of Sports Through a Boomer's Eyes. And that's written by Lawrence Richards. So check out the book and thank him for this topic here tonight. And I think Andrew and I kind of thought that this would just be a little bit more informal than some of our other episodes, and maybe just kind of talk about some teams in, really, I guess, just in the three major sports. But if you had anything in any of the others as well, Andrew, just sort of teams that either were very much expected to win the title, or in retrospect, looking back, it's surprising that they did not win the title.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one that's kind of loosely drawn, so we'll see if if we're in the same neighborhood with coming up with these. But just kind of a more loosely structured thing than our usual episodes.
So I came up with a list. I have somewhere between 4 and 12, I guess, thereabouts, in the three major sports, in the NBA, the NFL, and the in Major League Baseball. And so I thought maybe we would just go through some of that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's good. I think I have 6 or 7, depending on how you would look at it. I tried to avoid anything that we've definitely covered before, or that I know we're going to cover sometime soon. But for example, I didn't put anything about the 2007 Giants on here against the Patriots. I just feel like we've done enough of that. It's been something we've, I kind of steered clear of New York things that happened in my lifetime, either for positive or negative. It's also, this isn't meant to be a top 10 list or anything. It's just kind of we came up with some stuff to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So did you have anything for anything other than MLB, NFL, or NBA?
I wrote a college basketball one down, and I wrote a one hockey one down.
All right, why don't we start with those?
Okay. Well, not so much college as scholastic basketball. And we're talking about the 1997-1998 5th and 6th grade boys basketball title in St. Columba, won by my green team over heavily favored maroon. No. Do you want me to start with the hockey, or do you want me to start with the college basketball?
Either or.
All right. So for college basketball, I just wrote down 1991 UNLV against Duke. I tried to come up with some teams that like had some sort of connection, so not like, oh, this team was the number 1 seed. They lost in the first round to an 8 seed, and then a totally different team won a championship.
Yeah.
For the most part, there's like a connection there where they played. And in this case, it's two teams who played each other in the national championship game. And it was UNLV, who had won the national championship the year before. They had they'd been undefeated that year up until the national championship game, and then they were beaten by Duke, who went into that game with 7 losses. So, one of the more recent undefeated teams to not win a championship. I know there was a Kentucky team a few years ago, got closer to 10 years ago now, that lost in the Final Four to Wisconsin. But I just figured I would throw that in there. The defending national champions on the verge of back-to-back, being undefeated, number 1 all year, and they are upset in one of the biggest, best games of all time in the 91 national championship game.
Yeah, this is the beginning of the Duke mini run, the Bobby Hurley, Grant Hill, Christian Laettner teams, because I believe they'd win again the following year in 92, right?
Yeah, that was when they beat Michigan in 92, and then the next year was the UNC Michigan, the Chris Webber game.
Yeah, this is a Jerry Tarkanian team. Jerry Tarkanian coached UNLV team. 4 guys on this team are drafted in the 1991 NBA draft, including 3 in the first round. 2 future Knicks, Greg Anthony and Larry Johnson, as well as Stacey Augmon, who had a long career in the NBA as well. The Duke team does have Hurley, Hill, and Laettner, but like you said, it was 7. They had 7 losses during the season. What was their seed, that Duke team, in there?
So they were a 2 seed. Before I go any further, I did mess this up because I was looking at UNLV's schedule. This was the Final Four. Duke beat Kansas in the national championship game a few days later. I had it in my head that it was the national championship, and since I didn't see another game for UNLV, obviously, I just miscounted. But this was the semifinals. But yeah, Duke was the 2 seed.
And this was also Krzyzewski's first NCAA title. And you don't, from what I know, and I don't pretend any real expertise here, that's kind of the end of the big run for UNLV. The Wikipedia says they're often called the greatest college basketball team not to win a championship. Wikipedia is also not letting me skip forward to their 91-92 season. So I'm wondering if that's just like some sort of an error or something. I guess they were okay. So they also
won the national championship in the year before.
Yeah.
Oh, so you mean that specific team?
I'm sorry. What do you mean?
Well, when you said they're the best team not to win a championship, they won the year before.
Oh, yeah.
Single season.
I think they mean, that single season team. And then they don't make it in 92. Did they have some sort of a violation that year? Maybe
I am fairly sure there were some things that happened with let me not say any names until I look this up, but I am pretty sure there were some sort of violations that came out about guys possibly whom were named Larry Johnson, who may have gotten some improper benefits. In November of 93, they were placed on 3 years probation for major rules violations, many stemming from recruitment of former New York high school star Lloyd Daniels 7 years ago. Limited television appearances. Tarkanian was forced to resign after the 91-92 season.
Oh, and this UNLV team originally was had been banned from the 91 tournament. And then they were able to come to an agreement where they deferred it. But then they were banned from the 92 tournament. And then Tarkanian actually leaves to take the Spurs job in the NBA and lasts a mere 20 games and gets fired. Receives a 1.3 million settlement from the Spurs, and then he uses that money to fund a lawsuit against the NCAA. So, yeah, maybe that's a future episode one time, is the life and times and sketchy associations of Jerry Tarkanian. But yeah, that's not only do they lose in a Final Four that a lot of people didn't expect them to lose in, but it's also sort of very much downhill for the program from after that. So so that's your NCAA. What else did you have for hockey?
Just let me point out, by the way, I don't see anything immediately here that specifically Johnson was one of the ones at the center of the recruiting violations. He was just the best player on those teams, and I guess a lot of those guys still have a chip on their shoulder about the way they were portrayed by their own administration and by the national media and stuff like that.
You can call him Larry or LJ. You doesn't have to call him Johnson.
What's that from?
It's Ray J. Johnson.
Oh,
he was a comedian. He just had a mustache. He was just this guy, and they would say, "Hey, Johnson," and he would say, "My name is Raymond J. Johnson Jr. You can call me Ray, or you can call me Jay, or you can call me Junior, but you doesn't have to call me Johnson." And it just goes on for like 5 minutes.
25 years. The only other one I had is actually a little more of a local flair for you. And it's some of these I skewed more recently just because I was aware of sort of the perception at the time.
Yeah.
And I had actually in 2018, the Capitals and their history of playoff ineptitude in that era against the two-time defending Stanley Cup champion Penguins. And the Penguins, who were, making a serious run at a three-peat, and they play the Capitals in the second round again after years of either the Capitals being a 1 or a 2 seed and losing to worse teams. When they did get to the second round, it would always be against the Penguins before they ended up, they could never get past the Penguins. And then in this second year, they end up with, I guess it was 2018. Sorry, not 2019. I said 2018. Yeah. They end up with a series against the Capitals, and the Capitals beat them in 6 games and on their way to winning their Stanley Cup. So almost like the first time the Colts got past the Patriots, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
In I guess that would have been 06 in the AFC Championship game when the Colts got past the Patriots. That's not on the list because neither of them were considered powerhouse teams that year. But just a moment where you had been resigned to it was never going to happen, and they finally get past them and get their cup. And to date, that's the last one for Pittsburgh as well. Like they haven't gotten one since then.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And so you're saying the Caps got, you're right. The Caps got their cup in 18. That's exactly right. And then the Nationals won a year later in 19.
And they beat the Penguins, who were the two-time defending cup champions. They'd won one earlier in Crosby's career in 09. And the Capitals had this reputation, and I don't mean reputation as if it was unfair. It was a reputation based on what happened every year, where they would constantly just underachieve in the playoffs. They would, lose as a 1 seed to an 8 seed, or, a 2 seed to a 7 seed. And then the times they did get past the first round, it felt like they were constantly running up against Pittsburgh and never getting the better of them.
And there's also that whole Ovechkin-Crosby rivalry that had gone on for over a decade at this point.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of it. So, finally Ovechkin getting one over on Crosby.
So I only had 4 that really stuck out for the NBA. And maybe since we're in the middle of the NBA playoffs, this is sort of
you had 4 for each sport?
I only had 4 for the NBA.
Oh, okay. How many more do you have for?
I have like 7 or 8 for the other 2.
Oh, okay. You're gonna have probably a lot more than I. Yeah,
that's
so
fine.
We'll just kind of. All right.
Yeah, I mean,
if there's any that don't happen to be on your list, I'll discuss them. But
All right. So give me. Why don't we'll go back and forth to start. What'd you have for the NBA? Give me one for the NBA.
Well, I think the one that jumps out the most is '04, is the Lakers and the Pistons. To be honest, earlier than the '90s, it's hard to do a lot of NBA previous to that, because every year was like, what are you going to say? Oh, the second best team won the championship instead of the best team. Like, the Lakers, who had obviously, they'd won the championships the 3 years in a row, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, the Spurs get by them. So going into '04, they go out, they get Karl Malone, they get Gary Payton, they still have Shaq, they still have Kobe. And obviously, in hindsight, it was a very tumultuous year that led to Phil Jackson leaving for briefly, that led to Shaq leaving permanently. They sort of fell down for a couple of years. But at the time, and really up until the NBA Finals that year, they were seen as this like real unstoppable juggernaut team.
Yeah, Kobe's going through his rape trial for a good chunk of that year, too. That's the other big distraction. Like you say, in retrospect, it's just so obvious that they would lose. But at the time, they're a team that had won the previous three, not the year before, but the 3 years prior to that, they had won. They finished with a 56-26 record, which is first in their division. It's actually third in the conference, but it's within the 2 games of the Minnesota team that they end up beating in the conference finals. You got 4 future Hall of Famers in the starting lineup. It's really kind of the first effort to do, this type of super team thing. And in a lot of ways, they don't have a ton of trouble in the playoffs. They don't go to 7 games against anybody. They beat the Rockets in 5. They beat the Spurs and the Timberwolves in both in 6 apiece. But then they go against Detroit and they just get pretty much blown out of the water by this Detroit team. 5 games. They lose game 1, they win game 2, and then they lose by 20 points in game 3, 88-68. And then they lose 4, and then they lose 5 back in LA. And I think by the time game 5 rolled around, everybody had just kind of realized that the Lakers were done for. And this plucky, sort of gritty Pistons team, which really had been doing well. They were at the beginning of their string of being in the conference finals every single year. They were 54-28, didn't even win their division. And, this was a coming out year for the Pistons. Rasheed, Ben Wallace, they traded for Rasheed mid-year. So yeah, that's a team. It's a cool story if you're a Pistons fan, but it really is a shocking loss for this one last hurrah for the Shaq, Kobe, Phil Lakers.
Yeah, and the Pistons, like you said, they traded for Rasheed Wallace, actually from the Hawks. Rasheed Wallace played 1 game with the Hawks.
That's right.
They traded him from Portland. I think they'd acquired Billups maybe the year before, or maybe 2 years. Like, Billups hadn't been on the team very long. Ben Wallace had obviously been there a while. Rip Hamilton was kind of their young. He was the guy who was like still in the league years later. And then Tayshaun Prince was the 5th starter. The Lakers, they got through the playoffs. They beat the Spurs in the second round. And I was a senior in high school. Is actually, as I look at the NBA Finals that year, were like literally in like the waning moments of my senior year of high school. It was like while I was taking my last finals. And I remember in game 2, they played the Lakers in the finals, obviously, and the Pistons won game 1. And then in game 2 in LA, when the Pistons had a chance to go up 2, Kobe Bryant hit a shot at, I think, the buzzer to force overtime. And then the Lakers beat them by 8 in overtime. And I remember people talking the next day kind of like, yeah, that might have been their chance. They probably needed to win both of those. You kind of remember 2001 with the Sixers where they beat the Lakers in game 1. And you kind of thought, all right, watch the Lakers just reel off 3 straight. But instead they went to Boston, or that would have been weird. They went to Detroit, and I mean, that first game they held that Lakers team to 68 points, and then they beat them 2 in a row after that. The Lakers implode. The Pistons, almost get another one the next year. But, you know, like I said, I think in hindsight, people look back and see all the chaos. But it's not like they finished 38-44 that year. They were, they made the finals. They, beat the Spurs on their way to the finals. It wasn't until about game 4 where it was like, wow, they might actually not win the championship. It felt like a year-long coronation that year, at least to me.
So a couple others that I would mention that were also on the Lakers front. You could really probably talk about almost any year of the Lakers in the 60s when they were in the finals with the Celtics a bunch of times, lost every single time. And, some of those teams, the losing when Frank Selvey misses a jumper at the buzzer, or, somebody going cold, or somebody with the Celtics getting hot. So that was almost a yearly occurrence in the 1960s for the Lakers against the Celtics. But I want to talk about a couple of Laker teams, two in particular, that are in some ways very similar, but they're also close to 40 years apart. But it's both sort of the same thing. First of all, this is one that you sort of just alluded to, in 2011, 2012, or you didn't allude to it, but it's the same general time period. This is when the Lakers went out and brought in, adding to the Kobe Pau Gasol team, they added Steve Nash and they added Dwight Howard. And everybody was, I remember them being on the front page of Sports Illustrated, and everybody just expected them to be a juggernaut. In fact, the Lakers had tried to trade for Chris Paul, and David Stern had stepped in. I don't know if this was that season or the previous season. It might have even been that 2012. David Stern had basically stepped in and disallowed the trade. He found some sort of pretense to do it under. So the Lakers go in. Instead they bring in Steve Nash, who'd been a 2-time MVP at point guard for Phoenix. They bring in Dwight Howard, who later on in his career, Dwight Howard kind of got, I don't know, weird, I guess is the best way to say it. He kind of bounced around from team to team to team. He was back with the Lakers when they won the title in 2020 in the bubble year. Wasn't he?
Yeah, it was diminishing returns basically everywhere he went after this, including this. But at this point, he was fresh off taking Orlando to the finals, and that would have been 2010, right? 2009. Yeah. 2009, still being this like really dominant young. Because I remember at the time it was the Lakers are getting another big man in the prime of his career, or the Lakers are getting another big man who's still near the top of his game in the middle of his career, like they did with Shaq, like they did with Kareem, like they did with Wilt. Now Wilt was obviously towards the end of his career, but you know what I mean. That was sort of the thinking.
So, and this is another one where, in retrospect, it's obvious that it wasn't going to work. But they had been to the finals 3 years in a row. They under Phil. They had won in. They lost to Boston in 2008, then they'd won in 2009. They'd won in 2010. 2011, Phil's last year, they were 57-win team, which was just as many as they'd won the year before and been the champions. They got shocked by Dallas in the second round. They got swept by Dallas. But then the following year, in their first year under Mike Brown, they won 41 games in that lockout shortened season. And I just did a quick look. That was equivalent to 51 wins in an 82-game season. Lost in the conference finals, conference semis to Oklahoma City, who ended up going to the finals. So this was a team that had either been to the finals or lost to the eventual conference champion every year, and it just ends up being a disaster. And I'm sure if I had to look back, I'd remember the story here. I have to be honest, I don't. Mike Brown lasts 5 games as coach, and then they end up bringing in D'Antoni to be the coach of that team. I wonder if that had something to do with trying to cater to the Nash system. And then they make the playoff. Nash is hurt a lot. Howard gets hurt, I believe. They get swept in the first round by San Antonio, and then after that, it's just downhill. I think Nash never plays again. And then you enter this period of the last few years of Kobe's career where they're just like basically a 20-win team, and he's just sort of, it's all about Kobe for those last few years, just kind of putting up as many points as he can on a terrible team. But before the 12-13 season, I remember actually for a very brief period of time, I was part of this this basketball website called Hoops Examiner, and I think I wrote 3 articles or 2 articles maybe even for them, and this was one of them about this Laker team and what it would mean for the league for them to just run roughshod into a championship that year, but did not even come close to happening.
So you're talking about the 11-12 team or the 12-13 team?
12-13 was the Nash year, right?
Yeah, no, I didn't know what one you were talking about as like the team that, was expected to win a championship.
12-13, yeah.
12-13, okay. And that would have been actually the Heat, right? That was the second of the Heat's 3.
Yeah, so again that year they lost to the team that ended up going to the conference finals in San Antonio. Yeah, so
and that was the year with what's his name, Ray Allen, where he hit that shot, right?
Yeah,
Game 6, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're right. They get swept in the first round. They barely win more games than the year before, even though even with playing 16 less. But sort of the beginning of the downfall of the Lakers, while the Spurs or the Heat get their second one, their third straight appearance, and then would be a rematch of the finals the following year.
So a similar story is going back to the 68-69 season when Wilt Chamberlain joins up with an aging Elgin Baylor and Jerry West on the Lakers for the 68-69 season, a Laker team which had been to the NBA Finals the year before and lost in 6 to Boston. They bring on Wilt, who comes from Philly, who'd won a championship in Philly in 67, who'd gone to war with the Celtics, first as a Warrior and then later as a Philadelphia 76er. He joins this Laker team. They win. They lead the West. They make it to the finals against a Boston team that is very much sort of at the end of the line. Boston had finished 4th in the Eastern Division. They were the lowest seed in the Eastern Division, and they sort of got past Philly. They got past an up-and-coming Knicks team, and in a 7-game epic series that features so many future Hall of Famers, Baylor, West, Chamberlain on the one side. On the other side, you got Russell and Havlicek and Sam Jones. This aging Celtics team under Bill Russell as the player coach in its last hurrah, a series that goes 7 games and no home team wins a game until game 7 when the Celtics beat the Lakers 108-106. This is the game where Wilt asks out of the game with an injury, and the head coach of the Lakers, who's a gentleman by the name of Butch Brandvedikov, refuses to put Wilt back in the game, and he'd be gone the following year, Van Bredikov. And they lose. It's the last hurrah for this great Russell Celtic team of 12 or 13 years, and one of the great finals upsets in NBA history.
And I know we talked about this before. What was that when we did like the 10 greatest NBA finals or something episode?
Probably, yeah.
I knew it was a while ago, but I remember us talking at length about that series. I mean, the only thing I would push back on that is, can you really say the Russell Celtics weren't the favorites at any point? I mean, I understand what you're saying, but
I think that's one of those where it would be interesting to see what the talk was at the time. Everybody really knew that they were getting old.
I would imagine it would be about men landing on the moon.
Had that happened yet? Probably not. When was that? Because that was
didn't happen. The NBA Finals weren't in July, but it was getting close.
So I only have 2 more for basketball, and they're both 21st century. What else did you have?
That was the only, like I said, you said half a dozen. I thought you meant half a dozen total. I didn't realize you were going to have six. That was the only, like I said, I struggle with anything in the 80s or 90s in the NBA or even most of the 2000s where it's like, oh, I guess 2015, but that was another one where not 2015, 2016. But I feel like I talked so much about 2016 I didn't, mention that specifically. But what were you two?
Those are the other two I had. I had the 15-16 Warriors, which is the only team that lost to Cleveland in the NBA Finals. That was Durant's first year. Or no, that was actually not Durant's first year. That was the year before they brought in Durant. They were 73-9. They had beaten Cleveland the year before. They won the regular season. They broke the record for most regular season wins by an NBA team, 73-9 record. They had won it the year before, and we've talked about what happened in the finals. Draymond Green gets suspended for Game 6. Cleveland wins. It's this epic title for the city of Cleveland after the Cavs come back from 3-1. LeBron brings a championship back to his hometown. So we've talked about all of that. So that's one of the ones I had, and then the other one that I had that was a little bit different, and I don't know if you could necessarily put this team under the rubric of everybody thought they would win, but I did think it was just worth maybe mentioning the 2001-2002 Sacramento Kings.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this was the best of those Kings teams. Again, I have a hard time saying at any point they were favored over the Lakers, but this was certainly the team that had the, took the best swing at those Laker teams in that run. And, obviously whole books can be written about that. That wouldn't be a bad idea for a watch along that we didn't have anything to do with. Would be if we rewatched that Game 6, that Lakers Kings game.
The one with all the fouls.
Well, yeah, the one with all the officiating that was not on the up and up in Game 6, but that would be an interesting one.
That could be a good one.
But yeah, I mean, Game 6 is the closest you could ever see to a game that you knew they were not going to allow the Kings to win.
Yeah.
The ref, I mean, you look at the ref and you almost wonder, like, how much did they spend on the plastic surgery? They were identical. But so, yeah, but those Kings teams, I don't know if you want to talk specifics. This was the Chris Webber, Vlade Divac Kings teams.
The thing that I remember the most about that team, I guess two things. First of all, they were just so deep. They were basically too deep at every position. In fact, let me look at the box score for the Game 7 when they lost on their home floor 112 to 106. Where are they? Yeah, they had 8 guys who played over 20 minutes. It was Doug Christie and Hedo Turkoglu, Vlade, Bibby, Chris Webber, Stojakovic off the bench as the 6th man. Gerald Wallace was on that team too, and I don't know why he specifically didn't get into this game, but he was an important part as a rookie.
He was 19 years old.
A 19-year-old rookie on that team. So this was a really good, really deep team. And it was different because it was sort of the first team that was not about, whether it was a dominating big man or, high flyers. It was very much sort of a team. It was much more international in flavor than any good NBA team had been in the history of the league. It was Sacramento, who'd been terrible for forever. So it was just a good team. It was fun. It was an easy team to root for. If you were sick of the Lakers like I was, it was easy to maybe have them give you a little bit of hope. But yeah, maybe that's something we could talk about more in another more in-depth episode, but that was not meant to be.
Yeah, those teams that were, I mean, and if they had gotten past the Lakers, they were not going to have any trouble with the Nets. They were going to win the championship. Those were the height of the imbalance between the East and the West years. So it's fair to say they were very, very close to winning a championship.
So why don't we do football next? Like I said, I had a few more for football. We don't have to go too in depth on all of these, but just so first of all, before you give me some of yours, I did have the '07 Pats. You can't do an episode like this and not mention them. Would have been undefeated. Brady setting a record with 50 touchdown passes. You can't not have that on there, but that's we've talked about that team, and I'm sure we will continue to talk about that Giant team and Giants and Patriots teams in many contexts. Check out our Christmas Day watch along from 2022 that we did. I don't know what episode number that is, probably somewhere in the 60s. So if you want more on that team, that Patriot team, check out that watch along.
So I have a couple here to mention that you may not have. I would actually be surprised if you specifically have any of these. You want the older one first or the newer one first?
Give me the older one.
How about the 1969 Vikings?
Okay.
Who, I mean, technically did win an NFL championship, but they almost get lumped in with a few different things. And I've talked about this before with other stuff. I think I might have talked about it in the context of the 90s Bills or whatever, but when most of what you see as highlights of teams is of them looking inept in the Super Bowl, you tend to associate them, even though like those Vikings teams were in four of the first, 8 Super Bowls? Nine.
I think it was like 11.
No,
they lost.
But it was 4 in 8 years because the first one they were in was 4.
Yeah, 4 in 8 years. That's exactly right.
And you kind of look and you go, all right, well, after this, they lost to the 73 Dolphins, who were winning their second of back-to-back championships. Then they lost to the 74 Steelers, who were about to win back-to-back championships in 4 and 6 years. They lost to the 76 Oakland Raiders. None of those were really teams they should have beaten. But this team, I mean, this was a team and obviously it also gets overlapped by Super Bowl III. But this, the 68, the whole thing with the 68 Colts was they were 13-1 in the regular season, and they, had run roughshod through the league, and then the Jets and Joe Namath. This 69 Viking team was 12-2, and their last loss, they lost their first game of the year to the Giants, actually, and then they lost their last game of the year to I don't know who it was, but they had I'm assuming they had everything wrapped up because Joe Cap only threw like 3 passes and then it was somebody else the rest of the game. So I'm pretty sure they probably didn't play their starters or not as all out as, as they could have in that game. They go 12-2. They win the NFL championship. They were first in offense. They were first in defense. They were a dominant team, really every bit the dominant team the 1968 Colts were, just not without the, legacy, I guess you could say.
Brashness of Joe Namath and the fact that it was the first one. Yeah. 12-point favorites in the Super Bowl. They're not maybe necessarily the full all-time great, but they were first overall in defense, but the whole purple people eaters thing is something that maybe you hear more about on the 70s teams, but 3 future Hall of Famers on this defense, Carl Eller and Alan Page, 2 of the greatest defensive linemen of all time. Safety Paul Krause, who's another Hall of Famer. Jim Marshall, defensive end, who a lot of people think should be in the Hall of Fame. So yeah, so they were great. And then you have that one, and then I also had the 68 Colts, and everybody knows what happens there. Check out our interview with Bill Curry from last year if you want to hear more about that. But I actually just was listening to a radio broadcast of Super Bowl III a couple of weeks ago, and people were expecting the Colts to win that game by 30 points against the Jets, and the Jets managed to do everything they needed to do. Colts make a lot of mistakes and win 16-7. So both of those years, the 68 Colts and the 69 Vikings, they get sort of lost to history, or at least lost to history as far as how good they were because of what happened in the Super Bowl. And it's just funny to think if there had been no Super Bowl, how those teams might be remembered differently.
And I think also in an interesting way with the 68 Colts, and I don't want this to sound like I'm taking, it's a historically memorable game. I think there is sort of and not from people who probably, follow this stuff like we do, but like there's sort of this historical misconception, I feel like, in popular memory that like, well, once the Jets beat the Colts, the AFL proved they belong and they merged the leagues.
No,
and it's like the the leagues were merging anyway. They'd already been, that was, by 1967, they were sharing a draft because they were on the path to merging already. So there's a little bit of, and tying the two games in where it's like 4 is almost overlooked for its historical, like not significance, but sort of notability, whereas 68 might be overvalued in that regard.
The only thing that those wins might have impacted is that maybe that's what made the NFL decide that they didn't need to completely rejigger all of the divisions and the format, and that they could have the old AFL be its own conference, essentially, with a couple other teams added in, and compete every year in the Super Bowl, as opposed to needing it to just be a blowout type of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, so we talked about those two. What else did you have?
So this one is obscure. I would be very surprised if you have this. I have, in 2012, I have the 2012 Broncos, and that was Peyton Manning's first year in Denver. They had a really good year. I think that might have been the year he set a bunch of those records.
Yeah, he broke the records that Brady had broken that I talked about a few minutes ago.
And we have to remember that was not a given. It goes, it kind of stands to reason now that of course, it was still Peyton Manning. He had missed an entire season with neck problems, so much so that the Colts were willing to part with him, and nobody really disagreed with them. They had the number 1 overall pick.
Yeah.
They drafted Andrew Luck. Peyton Manning, though, pretty much immediately returned to form in 2012. The Broncos went 13-3. They were the number 1 seed in the AFC. And then they had that game in the divisional round against Baltimore where there was like a late Hail Mary kind of deal, and Baltimore ends up with the upset and ultimately went on to win the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and I should correct you. It was actually in 13 that he broke the record with the 55 touchdown passes.
Oh, okay.
I had that one because they were also 13-3 that year under John Fox and Peyton Manning. Made it all the way to the Super Bowl and then just got embarrassed. This was the New York Super Bowl, or the MetLife Stadium Super Bowl. They got embarrassed 43-8 by Seattle. So both of those years, and then 2 years later, they end up coming back and winning it with a much weaker team under Gary Kubiak, and that was when Manning had actually been benched mid-season for for Brock Osweiler, and then got his job back later in the year and ended up leading the Broncos. 15. What did I say?
Well, there was a year between the two Super Bowls.
Yeah. No, I said that. I said,
where it looked like they was over for them. They lost in the second round to the Colts, and it looked like it was over for them. But that year I was just talking about, by the way, Manning didn't do what he did the next year, but he did throw for 4,659 yards and 37 touchdowns at 36 years old, coming off of major neck surgery.
Oh yeah, no, he absolutely was so much more than anybody thought he would be coming back. So yeah. So in both 12 and 13, they were heavily favored, or could have been considered heavy favorites to win a title with one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time under center. And it was not until a couple years later, when he was much diminished, that they actually managed to win that title.
Yeah, they beat the year I'm talking about. They go to play Baltimore. Baltimore beats them in overtime in the second round. And then Baltimore goes on and they beat the Patriots in the AFC Championship game. They had lost to the Patriots the year before in kind of heartbreaking fashion, where they dropped the touchdown, and then what's his name? The guy who kicked all the Cundiff missed the chip shot field goal. And then they go on and beat the 49ers in the Super Bowl just to kind of close the gap on that Broncos team.
Did you have any other football?
Those are the two I had listed that I didn't think would come out. You'd mentioned. So,
all right. So I just had a few others that I think are worth mentioning, and I'll take them in reverse order. I had the 2001 Rams, the teams that lost to New England in the Super Bowl. They were 14-2, coached by Mike Martz. They were first in the league in points, and actually not that bad in defense. Only seventh in the league in points allowed. They had won in '99. Kurt Warner's Cinderella story. We talked about this when we did our greatest Super Bowls episode a few months back. They'd been Vermeil had retired after that Super Bowl. Mike Martz comes in. They lose a squeaker in the playoffs in the 2000 season, I believe. Why am I not?
They lost to the Saints in 2000. I know that.
They lost to the Saints in 2001. Oh, yeah, 28-31. Yeah, they lose to the Saints. But then they come back in 2001 and they sort of renew their reputation of a year before as the greatest show on turf. Marshall Faulk, 1,382 rushing yards. Isaac Bruce, future Hall of Famer, with 1,106. Torrey Holt, 1,363. They get almost another combined 1,000 yards from their 3 and 4 receivers, Ricky Prohl and Azahir Hakim. So this is a team with just a crazy, crazy offense. Everybody is expecting them to just roll over the Patriots. They had put up 45 points in the division round in a blowout of Green Bay. The Patriots were one of the biggest underdogs in Super Bowl history going into this game. The Rams were 14-point favorites, but behind some good luck and some really good defense and a sort of young Tom Brady, who was what nobody ever thought he would be. The Patriots eke it out on a Vinatieri field goal, and that's kind of really the Rams. They linger a little bit. They're a couple years later, they're back to 12-4, and I believe Warner is gone by that year. Well, he's on the team, but Mark Bulger takes over as quarterback.
3.
Yeah. So
yeah, Warner gets hurt early in the year, and then they go to Bulger, and Warner. It's one of those where Warner's back healthy, but they decide to stay with Bulger. I think that's when Kurt Warner's wife called into the St. Louis sports talk station to complain about Mike Martz when they stayed with Mark Bulger. I'm pretty sure that's what happened.
And they're garbage the following year too. They're 7-9. Warner must be hurt that year too because he only starts 7 games. They're garbage that year. They're 23rd in the league in offensive scoring that year. So they really take it. 02. Yeah, they really take a dive in 02. So another one of these teams that goes from being considered the dominant team in the league to down in the basement only a year later. I had the 90 49ers, the team that almost three-peated.
Interesting.
Joe Montana MVP in what ends up being his last. I mean, he plays a game a couple years later, but his last real season as a 49er. Joe Montana is the MVP. They lose in that epic, another game and another season that we've talked quite a bit about, but they lose in that epic NFC Championship game to the Giants and lose out on their chance for a three-peat. So I had them. I also had another team that was very, very good in the regular season and then lost on a field goal in the conference championship game, and that was the 98 Vikings. That Randy Moss rookie year, that team with Randall Cunningham as the quarterback. Randall Cunningham, who makes all pro at 35 years of age after almost being out of football for a while after he leaves the Eagles. 1,300 yards roughly receiving for Moss with 17 TDs. Chris Carter with 1,000. So 2 Hall of Fame receivers. You got a Hall of Fame offensive lineman in Randall McDaniel. Defense not quite as great, but they and we've talked about it before. Gary Anderson, having not missed a field goal all season, misses one in that game, and the Vikings lose. So the 90 49ers and the 98 Vikings, two number one seeds, two really, really good regular season teams with offenses chock full of Hall of Famers, both of whom lose on field goals in the waning minutes of the conference championship game.
Yeah. Obviously much different scenarios. That 90 game is, there's just so much in that game. There's the Giant, like late too. The Giants fake a punt that gets big yards up the middle. They have to get the fumble at the right at the end of the game. They get they force a fumble of Roger Craig and return the fumble or recover the fumble, which sets up the last touchdown. That 98 game, like you mentioned, that Viking team. Again, I can't say it was a year-long coronation for them, because on the other side you did have the Broncos, who were 13-0, but that Viking team was sort of doing things offensively that really hadn't been seen up to that point.
Yeah, and they lose a game that nobody expected them to lose. I only had two more for football, and they were going very, very much way back. And they're both Bears teams that were undefeated and lost in the NFL championship game, both coached by the legendary George Halas, although the second one, he missed part of the season for World War II. First, I have the 19. Okay, we're back. I must have hit the button by accident. Okay, so we might have stopped recording there for a minute. I was just saying that I had two teams, two very old Chicago Bear teams. The first one I had was the 1934 Bears, who finished with a record of 13-0, led by the great Hall of Fame backfield of Red Grange and Bronco Nagurski, coached by the legendary George Halas. They lost the NFL championship game to the New York Giants 30-13 at the Polo Grounds. And do you know what they call that game?
This is known as the sneakers game.
Correct.
Because the field, if I'd seen the history of the Giants DVD more recently, I'd try to just quote it verbatim. But the one part I remember is they talked to Bronco Nagurski. They said, or no, I forget who it was. Some of the Bears came over and got looking around. They saw that we had tennis shoes on. But and then Bronco Nagurski says something like, "There wasn't nothing wrong with it. It was legal. They outsmarted us." But so basically what happened, it's late in the year. It's sometime in December 9th. Is this correct here?
I think that's right.
Yeah. December 9th, 1934, Polo Grounds, obviously not a lot of what we would consider modern groundskeeping. The field was basically like frozen, and in a degree it wouldn't be these days if it was taken care of, really. So at about the Giants players didn't have good footing, so they essentially procured a bunch of sneakers from, I forget which college area teams.
Manhattan College.
Was it Manhattan College?
Yes.
Yeah, they went and basically got all their sneakers from the basketball team and wore them, and they had much better footing than the Bears did in the second half. So the Bears, who were up 10-3 at the end of the first half, ended up losing 30-13. Just to underscore it from a record standpoint, Bears came into this game 13-0. The Giants were 8-5, and the Giants bested them.
And then 8 years later, the Bears lost to the Washington Redskins in the 1942 NFL title game. This was the team that I alluded to. George Halas had left the team mid-season. They had won the championship the previous 2 years, including a blowout of Washington 73-0 in one of the most famous games in NFL history in 1940. They'd beaten the Giants 37-9 in 1941. This 42 team, the most prominent player is Sid Luckman, who, along with the Redskins' Sammy Baugh, is one of the two greatest quarterbacks in the NFL. And this was a team that had some real blowouts. Just to give you a couple of their scores going into the title game. So starting on November 1st, or actually let's start a week earlier. They beat the Eagles 45-14. They beat Detroit 16-0. They beat Brooklyn 35-0. Green Bay 38-7, Detroit 42-0, and Cleveland 47-0, and the Chicago Cardinals 21-7. So over the course of 6 games going into the title game, they've given up only 14 points, and they've scored 30 to 60, that's at about 73, another 100, and, like 180 to 14 over the last 6 games. So this is really, I don't know if there are odds going back this far. No, there's nothing on Football Reference, but good as the Redskins might have been, an undefeated 2-time defending champion who had not only won the last 2 title games going away, including embarrassing the Redskin team that they were playing 2 years earlier, but also had just been on such a tear in the latter half of the regular season. Them losing that game had to be considered just a tremendous upset. So to close out our football conversation here, 2 really great regular season Chicago Bear teams who both lost in heartbreaking fashion in the NFL title game.
And I think the through line on both of those is Ray Flaherty. Ray Flaherty was the coach of that Redskins team, in 42, and on 34 he was a player with the Giants. And I believe he's the one who told them that when he was in college at Gonzaga, they did a thing where they won a game wearing sneakers.
I think that's exactly right. Yep.
So Ray Flaherty is kind of the through line of the 2 teams that you mentioned.
All right, why don't we close it out with a little baseball? And I did have I think 7 or 8 baseball here too, that we can kind of zip through. But why don't you tell me what you had first?
All right. So I got a couple baseball ones. I could give you the what I did kind of recently, and I kind of used both teams, even though they didn't both win championships. But I included the 2010 Giants and the 2010 Rangers, who both went to the World Series that year, obviously won by the Giants. And that was the Yankees and the Phillies were the teams playing them in the AL and NLCSs. And the Phillies had won the pennant the last 2 years, had won the championship in 08. In 09, the Yankees had played the Phillies in the World Series and beaten them. In 2010, the Giants and Rangers, neither of whom had any real recent success to speak of. The Rangers hadn't ever been to a World Series. The Giants hadn't been to one in 8 years. It was a totally different team. And it was kind of seen as 2 upstarts. And, the Yankees and Phillies were headed towards a rematch of the prior year's World Series. And because I think that was also the Philly. Oh, no, it was 10, the Phillies added Cliff Lee. It was 11, they added Halladay.
That's right.
They kept adding aces and
yeah,
struggling more and getting one less round. But they still had, what was his name? Cole Hamels was their ace on that team. And the Yankees had that big game 1 comeback that year. And again, it seemed like, all right, they're in the Rangers' heads, and then I think the Rangers beat them 3 straight, and then the Yankees won a 5th game, and the Rangers beat them in 6. So 2 teams kind of toppling power there in the respective AL and NLCSs.
So Cliff Lee didn't actually get to the Phillies until 11.
Yeah, because the reason I know that is because in 10 he was a Ranger, because I saw him beat the Yankees in the game 3 of the ALCS that year. I was at that game.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess Halladay got there in 10, right?
Yeah, no, I think Halladay was the year after in 11, actually.
No, Halladay was there in 10 and 11. Lee came back in 11.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay. So that was definitely, and I remember that Yankee. I always remember because there was a picture of Nolan Ryan and George W. Bush sitting at that game 1 against the Yankees against the Rangers, both sitting looking as pissed off as can be that the Yankees had come back. And I had that as my Facebook profile picture for a while. But then, once the Yankees not only lost that series, but the Rangers went all the way to the World Series, it was a little less of a gloat that I could have. So I think I removed that when that happened.
Yeah, and obviously the Rangers got back the next year and were within like a strike twice in game 6 before they lost to the Cardinals. And I mean, they ultimately won last year, but that was sort of the end of that Ranger team.
Yeah. Was that your whole list?
No, so I mentioned I have 1906. I have the Cubs and the White Sox.
Yeah.
The Cubs were the biggest like single season wins record. What did they win, like 116 games or not? No, not 116, but
No, I'm pretty sure it was 100. They were 116, 36, and 3 in basically 100. What's that? 100 and I guess it was 154 or 150, about 150 games. Yeah. So
they did. You're right. 116 games. They, cruised obviously to the pennant. There was no real competition. They were this unstoppable machine that would then actually go on and win 2 straight titles in the 2 years after that. And they played the White Sox, who were their crosstown rivals, but really were not a highly regarded team. They won 93 games, which in its own right is a good total, but lowest batting average in the league, I believe. Definitely the lowest batting average to win a World Series ever. Or I believe so.
no, they are. I don't know if they are definitely, but they were known as the hitless wonders. Say they had the worst team batting average of 230 in the American League. So even for the early dead ball era, they were not a good offensive team.
Yeah, and then they meet their crosstown rivals in the World Series. I think the road team wins the first 5 games of the series. It's the first 7-game World Series because 03 and 05 were both best of 9, I believe. I know 03 was. And it seems like they rotated wins the first couple of games on the road, and then the White Sox won game 6 won game 5 and won game 6 and ended up winning the championship. But I had that as sort of the first early World Series upset.
A couple things I just noticed on Wikipedia that both of which I think are kind of cool about this World Series. First of all, it's the last time there's snow in a World Series for 90 years or 91 years. The next time it happens is 97 when the Marlins are playing the Indians. And I'd have to imagine that was in Cleveland, not Miami, that took place. The other thing is this baffles my mind here. This is the most recent World Series to feature 2 franchises that had never before appeared in a World Series.
I saw that, and they said it has to be now because
now that hasn't. The last 2 were the Nationals and the Mariners, and now that the Nationals have made it, so unless there's expansion, but you think sometime in the teens or the 20s that would have happened, or even maybe in the expansion era, but never happened.
Let me just real quick in the original era, the original team. So obviously the Red Sox, I'll use somewhat modern names. The Red Sox made it the first World Series as did the Pirates. In 05, the Giants made it, as did the A's. And then 06 was the Cubs and the White Sox. So there's 6 of your 16 teams, right?
Yeah.
The next 2 years was Detroit. So they're knocks off a 7th team, right?
In 09, Pittsburgh played Detroit. So there's another one.
They had both been already.
But you're right. But Detroit had been in 03. You're right. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So there's 7. I'm going to stop going chronologically now, but when the Yankees first made it, they played the Giants, who had already played. When the Dodgers made it, they played the Red Sox, right?
In 16, that's correct.
Yep. Same thing with the Phillies, they played the Red Sox the first time.
The Reds played the White Sox in the Black Sox year, 1919.
Yep.
Cleveland played Brooklyn in 20.
Yep. The Cardinals was the Yankees, right? 26.
Washington Senators was 24. They played Pittsburgh.
And the Browns was the Cardinals, which, I mean, by then the Browns, I think, were the Browns the last of the original 16 teams to win a pennant? They would have
the St. Louis Browns, later the Baltimore Orioles in 44 played. There was their only World Series in St. Louis. That was the Cardinals they played. So,
and then, I mean, let's not get ridiculous with this, but what was the first World Series to feature 2 non-original 16 teams?
Excuse me. First World Series to feature two non-original 16 teams. I feel like it didn't happen for a really long time.
Well, I'm trying to do it in my head, and I'm having a tough time coming up with it.
Has it ever happened?
It almost well, I don't want to say it almost has to have.
Who did the Twins play in 87? St. Louis?
Yeah, let me just put. Now we're on a different thing, but it's a good thing to be on. It's important that we get this done. Well,
Yeah,
I know for a fact the Royals and the Mets.
That might be it. Because who did the Giants?
The Giants are an original 16 team.
Yeah. The Rays played the Dodgers, and they played.
I'm going to
Philly.
start. Well, where should I start? In 62, I guess. Just that's when expansion really started. Yeah, if I can find one, I'm not going to look anywhere else. But the Mets were the first expansion team to win one in 69, but they played the Orioles.
Mm-hmm. Who had been the Browns.
A's are an original team. The Reds, the Yankees, the Pirates, the Phillies, the Dodgers, the Cardinals, Orioles, Phillies, Tigers, Padres, Royals with the Cardinals, Mets, Red Sox, Twins were the Senators, Dodgers, A's, Twins, the Blue Jays and the Braves, no. Blue Jays and the Phillies, no. Braves, Yankees, Marlins, Indians, Yankees, Diamondbacks. Angels, Giants, Marlins, Red Sox, White Sox. We're almost done, folks. I know this is not exciting. Giants, Cardinals, Giants, Red Sox, Royals, Mets in 15.
And this is from their Wikipedia. This is the first World Series in which both teams were formed after the 1960 season.
So Nationals, Astros, because the Nationals were the Expos, but that's not.
Yeah, and Texas, Arizona last year.
So it's happened 3 times in the last 9 years, but not ever before that. So just a little bit of an interesting aside, I thought.
Definitely. That's why we're here.
Well, it was definitely an aside. We'll leave it to you to decide if it was interesting.
And I should just apologize, folks. I'm trying not to cough too much here. In fact, I'm going to go get a throat lozenge if we could just take a quick break.
Okay.
So who else? You said we did the 06 Cubs. Who else did you have?
So I mentioned the 06 Cubs. I mentioned the 2010 teams. The only last one I'll mention, and again, I kind of cheated because they didn't win the World Series. I just put the 54 Indians on there winning the pennant. Just anybody knocking off that Yankees team that had won 5 straight pennants, and I know in 5 straight World Series actually. And you know, if you look at some of the years the Yankees didn't win the pennant, really in the Stengel era, in 59, they had a lot of guys hurt and they fell off. The 54 Yankees were still a really good team. The Indians were just for that year were that much better. So even though they end up losing and getting swept by the Giants, I just thought that was worth at least mentioning, like knocking off that Yankee team in a pure pennant race when they're not, you know, like I said, didn't even really have a particularly bad year. They won 103 games.
The 54 Yankees were the only 100-win team, and keep in mind you're talking about 154 games here, but still, the only 100-win team of the Stengel years. They're the best team of the Stengel years record-wise, and the Indians still beat them by 8 games. I kind of had this down sort of for both sides of it. Yeah, on the one hand, it's an upset that the Indians beat the Yankees and prevent them from going to their 6th World Series in a row. On the other hand, it's an upset that once they're in the World Series, they lose to a Giants team that is a lesser team. Now, it's hard to look at a team with Willie Mays, even though this is only really Willie's 2nd full year, because he had a couple years he missed for military service. It's hard to look at any Willie Mays-led Giant team and think of them as an upstart underdog type team, but they were, you know, they were only a 97-win team, so they were 14 games worse than the Indians. And not only do the Indians lose to the Giants, but they just get completely swept by them. Willie Mays makes his historic, famous over-the-shoulder catch. So yeah, this one definitely belongs in sort of in both columns, both the Yankees not winning and then the Indians also not winning once they make it to the World Series.
Yeah, and of course you have that sort of iconic that game one of '54 where Mays makes that catch, and then later the Giants win on a home run that just gets out in
Dusty
right
Rhodes.
Yeah, and they say that basically the Indians lost that game on a ball that would have been a home run anywhere else in baseball.
Yeah,
and another ball that wouldn't have been a home run anywhere else in baseball. And I have a book on the 1954 season, and there actually became a bit of controversy in New York after that game because they referred to Dusty Rhodes' home run as a Chinese home run. And I guess they did interview some Chinese Americans who were not happy with that characterization. They were less listened to back then, but I just thought it was interesting that they at least did mention, like, yeah, what the hell, like, but yeah, so and then of course that begins the Indians' long doldrums into, long descent into the doldrums, and still have not won a championship, although they've been back to 3 World Series at this point. But yeah, so I think beating the Yankees out for the pennant and then not being able to complete it kind of gets them on both sides of this equation.
All right, so I just had a few more.
Okay.
And maybe we'll just kind of take these in chronological order of how I had them. I had the 1931 Philadelphia Athletics. Now, the A's had won the World Series 2 years before, 104 win team in 29 and 102 win team in 30. But I thought that the 31 team was particularly worth mentioning because this was a team 107 wins led by a 31 game winner in Lefty Grove. Does he win the pitching triple crown this year? I wouldn't be surprised if he did. Yeah, he leads in ERA. He obviously leads in wins, and he leads in strikeouts. Yeah, so and he's also the MVP. He's the American League MVP as a pitcher with a 31-8 record. This is a starting lineup that is chock full of future Hall of Famers: Mickey Cochran at catcher, Jimmy Fox at first base, Al Simmons in the outfield. And so this is a really, really good team. Definitely the best regular season team of these late 20s, early 30s athletics teams. So, and they lose a 7-game World Series to the St. Louis Cardinals, who were, 101 win team in their own right, but not anything as dominant as the Athletics had been in the previous 2 years. So I thought they were worth mentioning, even though there's a little bit of an asterisk there because they had won the 2 years previous.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. I mean, you win the 3 in a row and you get into sort of the rare air, mostly occupied by Yankee teams and the 72 to 74 A's.
Yeah, the only other team in baseball history who's won the 3 in a row were the 40 years later, the A's in Oakland.
Yeah.
So
what else did you have?
So this was another one that, even though the team had won it, wins it a couple years later, I had the 1953 Dodgers. This is largely considered the best regular season team of the boys of summer Dodgers. They're 105-49. Just as by contrast, the team that wins the World Series 2 years later is a 98 win team. So not quite as good. This Roy Campanella wins his second of 3 MVP awards in this season. They have the batting title. They're out, and this is the 50s, obviously, so it's a little bit skewed, but they've got 5 future Hall of Famers in the regular starting lineup. They got Campanella, they got Gil Hodges, they got Pee Wee Reese at shortstop, and then the outfield is Duke Snyder, Jackie Robinson, who'd moved from second to the outfield to accommodate the young junior Jim Jr. Gilliam. And then the third outfielder, who is not a Hall of Famer, is Carl Furillo. But Carl Furillo hits .344 and wins the batting title in 1953. So this is the team that everybody talks about as sort of the great boys of summer Dodger team. Their best pitcher is Carl Erskine, who wins 20 games, goes 20-6. He actually just passed away a few days ago, Carl Erskine, and we'll talk about him in our 2024 in memoriam. They go to the World Series. They lose the World Series in 6 to the Yankees. Yankees win the first 2. Brooklyn wins the second 2. And then the Yankees win game 5 and game 6. Yankees win game 5, 4-3. And they win. How does that series end? Because they win it in the bottom of the 9th. They lose it on a single by Billy Martin that scores Hank Bauer. Billy Martin, who has an amazing World Series in 53. And that was the team where everybody kind of says, if the Dodgers didn't win it this year, they're never going to win.
Yeah, by 55, they were actually old, getting kind of older, and they thought they really had a few, maybe 1 year left, and obviously not knowing what was coming on the horizon, where they weren't going to even be in Brooklyn much longer. But yeah, the 53 team, it seems like, was the team that it was kind of like, well, if they didn't do it this year, that's probably it. And they were wrong, but
it's hard for me to put a Yankee team on here, but there was one that I thought I should put on there, and that was 1960. The Yankees lose a 7-game series to the Pittsburgh Pirates. That's the famous Bill Mazeroski home run. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe the Yankees outscored Pittsburgh in this series 55-27. The Yankees' 3 losses are 6-4, 3-2, 5-2, and then 10-9 in game 7. Their 3 wins are 16-3, 10-0, and 12-0. So they outscore the Pirates 38-3 in their 3 victories. Dominant team. Stengel's last year. Roger Maris's first year as a Yankee. Everybody was shocked. Mickey Mantle said that it was the only World Series he ever played in where he felt like the better team lost. And that's the 60 Yankees losing to the 1960 Pirates on that famous Bill Mazeroski home run off of Ralph Terry.
And he would have lost what? They lost in 55 and 57, and then 63 and 64.
Correct. Yeah. Those were the 5 that he lost. And it's the only one he said where he felt like the better team lost. So,
all right.
I jumped ahead a little bit here. I actually jumped ahead quite a bit. I actually had 2 teams from 1988. First, I had the 1988 Mets. This was a team that had won the World Series 2 years previous. They finished with a 160 record. They must have had 2 games that were rained out that they didn't need to play for one reason or another. The team is basically the same as what it had been the 2 years earlier, especially the lineup is essentially exactly the same. Kevin McReynolds had come over prior to the 87 season and was one of he was the starting left fielder. He had not been on the 86 team. Similarly, the pitching staff is basically the same guys. It's still Gooden, who, even though his best years are behind him, is only 23 years of age in 1988. Gooden wins 18. Ron Darling wins 17. But their best pitcher that year is actually another guy who had not been on the team in 86, and that's David Cone, who finishes 3rd in the Cy Young voting, but I really feel like he finishes 3rd to Oral Hershiser and Danny Jackson of Cleveland. But this is Cone's 1988 with the Mets, 20-3 with a 2.22 ERA and 213 strikeouts. So heck of a year for David Cone. Definitely his best year as a Met. And the Mets go into this NL Championship Series against a weaker team, especially offensively, a much weaker Dodger team, and they lose to the Dodgers in 7 games. This is the series where I think it's game 4. Oh no, game 4 is Kirk Gibson. What was the game where Mike Scioscia hit a home run to win it for the Dodgers? What game was that? If you give me a minute, I'll find it here. It might have been game 2, but a much weaker Dodger team who beats the Mets in that NLCS. Everybody thought that 1987 had just been sort of a fluke, and that, Doc Gooden had been suspended and there'd been some injuries and stuff. But going into that 88 postseason, everybody really thought that the Mets were the next big dynasty in baseball. And so that loss to the Dodgers, it was game 4. It was game 4. He hits a home run off. Socha hits a home run off Gooden in game 4 of the 88 NLCS, even though he'd only hit 3 home runs the entire season. So a huge upset. And the Mets, they linger for another couple of years. The following year, they're an 87 win team, not so great. But then I think in 90 they bounce back. They're a 91 win team, and I think they battle for the NL East. Yeah, they lose the NL East by 4 to Pittsburgh in 90, but I think they were in it up until close to the end. So that was sort of considered the falling, sort of like with the Rams, a team that had won 2 years ago and then struggled in the middle year. But everybody thought the Mets were the best team in baseball, at least the best team in the National League in 1988. And they lost to what was very much considered a much weaker Dodger team.
Yeah, and didn't they own the Dodgers in the regular season that year?
I think that's right. I think they'd beaten them like 11 or 12 or something like that. Let me see if I can.
See if you can pull that up.
10 of 11.
Okay.
10 of 11, and they'd outscored them 49-18. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In 90, as late as September 18th, they were half a game back, and then they kind of fell out of it fairly quickly, after that. But, Pittsburgh wouldn't have clinched till the 4 or 5 games left in the season based on how many games back they were. But yeah, I knew the Mets had sort of owned them in 88 in the regular season. And then, the Dodgers, I think the thing that happened in that series too was Oral Hershiser was just so damn good.
I actually remember going to a Mets-Phillies game in that September of 90 when they were in a fight with the Pirates for a World Series game, but for the division. It was a really cool atmosphere. It was one of the first baseball games I ever went to. So I also had for 88 and for 90, I had the A's teams that, even though they won the World Series over the Giants in the earthquake year of 89, they were really, really good in both 88 and 90. In fact, 88 and 90, 88, they won 104 games, 89, 99, and then 103 in 1990. So that team that won it in 89 was actually their weakest regular season team of the 3 years. This is the Bass brothers. This is Canseco and McGuire. 88, Jose Canseco has just a monster year. He must be MVP this year. He's got to be. 42 home runs, 124 RBIs, and even a 307 batting average, which I think is the only time Jose Canseco ever hits 300 in his major league career. Eckersley's the closer, 45 saves. Dave Stewart's a 21 game winner. They actually don't have Ricky Henderson on this team. Henderson is still with the Yankees. He gets traded to the Yankees mid-year in 89, and then it's more of the same in 90. This is still Canseco. This is still McGuire. 37 from Canseco in 1990, 39 from McGuire. Even Ricky Henderson, who's the MVP in 1990, steals 65 bases, hits 325, and actually hits 28 home runs, which I have to imagine would be the best of his career. 1990, they also get Bob Welsh, former Dodger, winning 27 games, leading the league and taking the Cy Young home in 90. So both years, 88 and 90, they lose. In 90, they get swept by the out of nowhere Cincinnati Reds, who were a 91 win team. So they're 12 games worse than the A's had been. And then in 88, they lose to that same weak hitting Dodger team who had been, a 94 win team. So even though they win a year in the middle, two really, really, really powerful offensive teams in 88 and 90 both of whom get beat once 4-1 and once 4-0 by much weaker National League teams.
Going back to Canseco, because I looked this up, that was the 88. He hit 307. That was his highest year. He hit 300 in 85 when he was 20 years old, but he only played in 29 games, so we won't count that. He did hit 300 one other time in a relatively full season. He hit 306 in 102 games in 1995 with the Red Sox.
Oh, okay. He did have a little bit of a renaissance there with them, didn't he? A very brief renaissance.
Yeah, I think he was with them for like 2 years, but that year he did hit 395 before going back to Oakland in 97.
So I just had two others. One of them you could probably guess. It's the 01 Mariners, the 116 win team, which broke the 98 Yankees American League record from a few years previous. This is Ichiro's rookie year where he wins both MVP and Rookie of the Year. Probably Ichiro's best year as a pro. He hits 350. How many hits does he have this year? It's a couple years later, 242 hits. I think it's a couple years later where he breaks the single season record. Yeah, and in 2004 he has 262 hits, which I believe is the most in a single regular season. And this is just a dominant, despite the fact that they had lost A-Rod after the 2000 season when A-Rod signed with Texas. This is a team, with not a super impressive pitching staff. This is Freddie Garcia and Aaron Seeley and Jamie Moyer and Paul Abbott. Not exactly a lights out pitching squad, but they got a Hall of Fame DH in Edgar Martinez. They got Brett Boone, who's got a career year here with 37 home runs and a 331 average from Brett Boone. I have to ask some questions about whether that might have been chemically aided, but that's a story for a different time. Yeah, two Hall of Famers, Ichiro and Edgar. They barely get by Cleveland in the ALDS, 5-game win over the Indians, and then they go to the ALCS against a much, much weaker Yankee team. This Yankee team was, 20 games worse than them during the regular season, and the Yankees, who had barely gotten by Oakland in the ALDS, they needed that famous Jeter flip play. They needed to come back down from 2-0 to win that series. But even so, the Yankees rally, and other than, I think, one blowout game in that ALCS, the Mariners win game 3, 14-3. It's really not a contest in the 01 ALCS. The Yankees really just disposed of Seattle.
Didn't they win it in 5 games?
5 games, yeah. They won in 5 games. Yeah, it wasn't close.
Yeah, because I remember hearing with I was Pinella. I was like, "Oh, this series is going back to Seattle." I was like, "You won 116 games, and that's your big proclamation is that you're going to get the ALCS back home," and then
didn't do it.
Ichiro, by the way, in 2004, 262 hits, which broke the record. The prior record was George Sisler,
right? Yeah.
In 1920 with 257. I'll just give you the years of everybody, the next few down the list. 1920, 1929, 1930, 1925, 1922, 1930, 1911, 1922, until you get to number 10, 2001, which was again Ichiro. So
yeah. Most hits anybody's had in 70 some odd years, and he does it twice.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one I wanted to mention, and this is a little bit off the beaten path. This is the 2006, and this is both the Mets and the Yankees in 2006, because the Yankees and the Mets had the 2 best records in all of Major League Baseball. The Mets were 97 and 65, and the Yankees were also 97 and 65. Both had the best records in their respective leagues. The Yankees, this was sort of perhaps the most star-studded team that the Yankees had during that whole Torre era, because they had signed Randy Johnson, they had signed Mike Mussina, obviously, a few years prior to that. 2 future Hall of Fame pitchers. Obviously, there's Rivera, but then there's Jeter, there's A-Rod, there's Johnny Damon, Jason Giambi, Matsui, Gary Sheffield. this team, maybe more than any other, is one of the late Tory year Yankee teams that was just so full of stars, but had no cohesion as a team. And that was proven by the fact that in the ALDS, they lost 3-1 in a series that really was not at all competitive to a much weaker Detroit Tigers team. And this was kind of the beginning of the end of the Joe Torre era. He manages one more season, but after losing to the Tigers with this team and this lineup and this payroll, this was kind of considered the end for, or the beginning of the end, I guess, for Joe Torre. And then the Mets, this is actually the only Met playoff appearance of this whole Willie Randolph era. They actually blow the pennant late in the season in both 2007 and in 2008. But 06, best record, tied for the best record in all of baseball. They've got Hall of Famers from other places on the pitching staff, guys like Tom Glavine and Pedro Martinez, just to name a few. Also a 40-year-old Orlando Hernandez. David Wright is 23 and coming to his own, hits 311. Best players, probably Carlos Beltran, who would come over a few years earlier as a free agent. They get 41 homers from Beltran, another 38 from Carlos Delgado. So a star-studded lineup, a star veteran pitching staff, and they lose to a much worse team, a much, much worse team, the eventual world champion St. Louis Cardinals, who had only been 83 and 78. And that's the famous at bat where Adam Wainwright strikes out Carlos Beltran. I believe he strikes him out looking in the bottom of the ninth of Game 7 of the NLCS.
Yeah, I think the Mets is the stronger case there. That was a really, really good Mets team. The two teams that ended up going to the World Series that year, Detroit and St. Louis, both had horrible Septembers. I want to say Detroit blew the division at like the last possible day of the year, although I don't know who would have won the division that year.
I think that's right. Who would that have been? Probably, I think it was Minnesota.
And they would have played who the hell in the first round? I'm going to check this real quick. But that Mets team was really, really good, and felt like they were the best. Yeah. Oh yeah. So Detroit blew the division. Minnesota ended up winning it. Oakland got the 3, and obviously Detroit lost. Detroit beat the Yankees. Did Minnesota beat Oakland? And then that was the ALCS that year. Was Minnesota and Detroit?
Minnesota and Detroit. That's exactly what it was.
All right. Yeah, that's the one thing with the money ball they always pass up is how many times Oakland lost to Minnesota in the playoffs too. It wasn't always the Yankees. But that Met team, was really good. And then you're right that the next year they were in my opinion, they were the best team in the National League. And they just kept, I remember it was my senior year, it was the beginning of my senior year of college, and they just kept losing every night. Yeah. And I remember a couple of times just turning on like WFAN on my computer at like 10 o'clock at night, just being like, this is probably gonna be pretty funny because they kept collapsing. And then the next year they fired Willie and they brought in who the hell was it? Manuel.
Yep.
And then the same thing happened. Because they did the last day of the year in 08, they did the tribute to Shea, but they did it after the game. So the team finished their second straight collapse, and then here came all the Mets legends to do like the goodbye to Shea Stadium, and it was like that's why you don't do that at the end of the game.
It was fitting for Mets fans to have one last heartbreaking loss. So
fair enough.
All right. Well, this was fun. This was a cool little suggestion. Again, I want to thank Mr. Lawrence Richards, author of Sports and Boomers, The History of Sports Through a Boomer's Eyes, for a suggestion. And I want to thank and apologize to all of our listeners for my my cough that hopefully I'll be able to edit out most of. But nonetheless, I appreciate everybody sticking with us during that time. So this is a fun little episode that got us to talk about, kind of a lot of different things at once tonight.
Yeah. It's always good to have a change of pace.
Cool. All right. Well, we look forward to another episode, and thank you all for listening as always. And until next time, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.